Oh, welcome everybody. Hello, Jonathan. Hello, Raywin. And a couple of little points first. Does everybody know how to raise a hand using reactions? If you go to the bottom of your screen and you can find a thumbs up or a clap or a raise hand, and you can raise a hand like I've just done and then put it down again. So it's just a useful thing to know how to do, because sometimes I see a wave and sometimes I don't. Jill's going to help me spot as well if there's a hand raised and I miss it. Okay. Oh, can I ask? Hello, Joe. You become visible. And, hello, Hank. Good to see you. Who's got a copy of the book? Hands up for if you have a copy of the book. Yeah. And great. And can I ask who hasn't? Is there anybody here who hasn't got a copy of the book? Yeah?
Mine's on the way.
On the way. Yeah.
I'm in Canada, so it takes a while.
Yes, well, they're still going out there around the world. Okay, is there anyone here who doesn't know my work at all? Can you hear me?
I'm a new student to, I've just started my training, my first proper term, so I don't really know much at this stage.
Okay. Well, some of it may go over your head, and you know, some of it you may go, yes, that makes sense. So yes, ride the roller coaster, see how you find it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Where are you training?
With Karen Wentworth in London.
Yes, lovely. Yeah, great. Okay. Okay, so what I'm going to do is just talk a bit to start with about how this all came about, and an overview of the book, give you some idea of the material in there. And so I'll talk for maybe 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll open the discussion and we'll see what people who have the book will have questions, I hope, and people who haven't got the book may have questions from what they heard. Some of you might have heard Robert Rickover's podcasts, perhaps, or seen the webinar that's up there. There's various things up there, but some of you might have heard nothing, seen nothing yet. So can everybody hear me okay? Yeah, good. I have been having a bit of trouble with my sound this week, but I think it's been okay today. But just in case it drops, wave at me furiously, and I'll go back. I think it's okay today. So yes, I started by doing a zoology degree a long time ago, and it was very much whole animals, looking at how systems integrate then, ecology and whole organisms and behavior. And then I discovered Alexander technique and realized this is what I wanted to do. Fell out with science in a big way at the time. And my first teachers, my first lessons were back in 1983. And my first teachers were Carrington teachers. And then I ended up going to a McDonald's school, Misha Magadoff, where I loved the oppositions and the strength they developed, and there was a lot of play and movement and vitality. And people got very confident in what they were doing, and most people went out and built good practices. And when I finished, I indeed went out and built a good practice. But after 6 months, my use fell apart because I realized I did not know how to look after myself. And that's when I went to Miss Goldie. And she wasted no time in telling me what a mess I was. She would say things like, "You ask me that, and you call yourself a teacher of the Alexander technique? Why, Mr. Alexander would be turning in his grave if he could see what you are doing in the name of his technique. Well, fortunately, I already knew how to shed insulting material off and just listen for the message underneath it. And the message was quite clear: you're a mess, you don't know what you're doing. And I also gathered she thought she could sort it. So that was good enough for me. So I survived the insults, and she proceeded to take me apart. I came with an upright stance. I could sit beautifully upright. Within a couple of lessons, she'd collapsed it because she'd picked up the fixes in that. It wasn't a balanced dynamic use, it was a fixed use. And so she collapsed it. She told me I had a weak back, which confused me. I'd put on muscle at Misha's, but no, it was a weak back to her. It was 6 months before I could sit straight again, because she built me up in a whole different way with dynamic use, this time from the core. And it was a much more integrated use and much stronger, in fact, than before. And at the same time, she was teaching me to come to quiet and to come present in my life, to stop rushing around, stop barging about, as she called it, and actually come present. And then something rather wonderful happened. When I came present, before, say, lifting my kettle, then my hand moved in a different way. I picked up the kettle in a whole different way. I was in relationship to the kettle, different muscles came into play. And she got me to understand that I'd understood the discovery process that Alexander used, because it turned the technique on its head. We're given a formula, which of course is needed for the survival of the technique, the formula: let the neck be free, head go forward and up, back lengthen and widen, and so on. And so we know what to do to bring about the good use. But she taught me how just to come present and quiet, and the good use emerged, and one rediscovered primary control all over again. And she wanted every moment to be a discovery process out of this place of quiet. And that was revolutionary, because right from the beginning, I'd been asking, how did Alexander develop this? He had nobody to put hands on him. I'm sure many of you have asked the same question. And I can remember asking a head of training early on this question, and she said, oh, Alexander was a terribly clever man, we can't do that. And I thought, fudge, you don't know. And it didn't seem anybody knew at that point. So Miss Goldie's work, I worked with her for 4 years, and I was so different at the end of it. There was such a different way in which she organized my body, a very different biomechanical use that I did not understand, moves that I'd never met on any training course from, I say, either the Carrington or the McDonald lineages. Very, very different stuff. And so that set me on a 30-year journey to say, what happened? How do I recapture this for myself? How do I understand it? How could I teach it to others? And that took me to a lot of different teachers and up a lot of different avenues. I went back to John Hunter, who had been one of the assistants on the training course, and he'd worked extensively with Goldie, and then he'd gone to Erica Whitaker. And he put on a series of workshops where he also was trying to answer this question: why is this work so different? What is it about it? And I learned a lot from him. And then I went to Erica myself. And from there, the journey continued. I discovered Peter Grunwald's work. I was already doing natural vision technique, and Grunwald, of course, takes it further, the natural vision work. I discovered Bob Britton and his functional anatomy, and that opened my eyes to anatomy as something of interest, joined up anatomy, rather than the itsy bitsy anatomy that is normally taught, that to me has no interest whatsoever because it's not joined up. I did some craniosacral, and that opened tensegrity theory and introduced me to Thomas Myers and the anatomy trains, the myofascial linkages that are there to support us, stabilize us, and move us, and can give, I think it's so important for the Alexander world. I discovered Philip Shepherd with his much deeper understanding of embodiment that also seemed to link back to a lot of what Goldie was doing. What else? There were many avenues that came together, but still there was something missing, because just after we moved to Ireland, I fell very ill again, because I'd had chronic fatigue syndrome for years, and another great hit of it happened after we moved. I think partly burnout from the move and various other factors. And I was pretty bedbound, housebound for over a year. And it took a lot to build up my strength after that. I just lost all my strength. And I very much worked with my Goldie principles of come to quiet, let the right thing do itself. And certainly that brought my nervous system back into alignment and brought me back into alignment, but it didn't bring me back the strength. And I kept thinking, where does the strength come back? How do I use Goldie's work for the strength? And I couldn't find it. And then Rosa Louisa, hi Rosa Louisa,
Hi.
came to stay with me in Ireland, and she suggested that I look up the work of Jando Masuero. And I did. And it was fantastic that you did that, Rosa, because he had been asking the same questions as me, but he went more for the biomechanics of the side of it. And he also was investigating the link with Delsart, because, as many of you will know, Alexander advertised on one of his very first business cards that he was a teacher of the Delsart method. And everybody was like, what's that? Because what is now known as Delsart doesn't really bear any relationship to Alexander work at all. And Jando read Delsart in the original French and started to uncover the little mosaic of clues that are scattered through Delsart's writing, from which he started to recreate what Alexander must have been doing very early on to free off his own deep tensions. And these are some quite strong pulls. So and also totally using CCC, constructive conscious guidance and control, in order to bring that about. It's a totally reasoned process. And the first lesson that I took with Jando, he kept waiting for me to reject him, because he said every senior teacher feels his work, goes, this doesn't feel like Alexander, and walks out. And part of my head indeed wanted to do that. Has anyone here worked with Jando? It's, yeah, one or two people. It's very, very different, isn't it? And so part of me was thinking, God, this is weird. This is not Alexander. And then another part of my observing consciousness noticed that actually what he was bringing about were exactly the same pulls that Goldie used to do on me. And he was bringing about the same new biomechanical alignment that her work brought about. And at that point, I was hooked, because here was the missing link. And using his work, I was then able to rebuild the strength that she had brought in me all those years before, but with the ME illnesses I had lost. And I was now able to do it for myself. And I then took Jando's work and matched it with the anatomy trains to start to work out anatomically what are the myofascial trains that we're activating, and worked out a few more of my own as well. And the whole picture started to come together of what we actually are trying to do in the technique, both at the nervous system level and at the biomechanical level, because we're doing something both very simple and immensely complex and totally all embracing. Alongside that, of course, was I started to ask, okay, so what's the science behind this? Because Goldie's work brought about such a precision of movement and such a precision of change in the nervous system that was repeatable. And again, I thought there has to be science behind it. And I started to read the neuroscience. Missy Vineyard helped me sort of clue in, and various other people did as well, and started to put together an image of how the nervous system is behind what we do. And then I've discussed my ideas with Tim Cacciatore, and he's come up with a lot of the same conclusions. We be thinking along fairly similar lines, which was nice because he's come from a pure science background to it. And so the book came about. So it's a huge book for those who've got it. It's big, it's complex, and there's a quick overview of it. With the three parts. The first sets the scene with the basic biomechanics, but also the very new thinking that we need. Because again, with the Grunwald work, but also Erica Whitaker, she taught us that when Alexander went to put hands on a pupil, he wasn't led by his hands, he was led by his eyes. And Erica taught us to lead movement, to have a movement led by the eyes, led by what you're engaged with, which is, after all, how a cat goes after a mouse. The cat sees the mouse, and the sight of the mouse excites responses in the cat, and the cat then goes into the crouch, and then into the crawl, and then into the stalk, and finally into the pounce. And it's all brought about in dynamic relationship with the mouse, whether the mouse knows it or not. And that, in a sense, describes Alexander's core discovery, I think. His real discovery is that if we can cue the nervous system correctly and precisely, our systems will reorganize, they will self-organize, and our evolutionarily correct, wrong word that, but our evolutionarily designed movement and posture will actually come into play. Our systems will self-organize if only we get off the computer, stop end-gaining, stop trying too hard, stop being elsewhere, all the things that modern life brings about in us. If we can come back to this present quiet with some of these clear biomechanical directions and clear reasoning, we can actually self-organize. And that's what Goldie taught me, and that's what the book is now about. So, enough from me. Would anyone like to start the discussion? Does anyone have any questions that come out of what I've said already, or out of the reading you've done? Joe.
Hello, it's a very basic question, so I might as well kick off a bit. You mentioned that was incredibly fascinating. Thank you so much. Really was. You mentioned some very interesting people, and one of them I've not heard before, and it was Jando somebody, and I wanted you to repeat the second name.
Masuero.
Masuero.
Masuero. Yes.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It's fascinating.
And of course, he's well referenced in the book. That's if you have that. Yes. Thank you. Anyone else want to kick off?
I want to ask a question, Penelope. Did Jando create these pulls? Where do they come from?
Well, I think he's used a mixture of clues out of particularly the early books, and out of what's come down to us, like hands on back of chair, and even phrases, pull to the elbow and knees forwards and away. I mean, they can be done as releases, but they can also be done as pulls. And so he's used a mosaic of clues. And what intrigues me about his pulls is they then match what Goldie was bringing about in me, because otherwise I wouldn't have a clue whether Jando's pulls were right or not, whether they were in line with what Alexander was doing. But because they match with what Miss Goldie was doing, I believe them. And I think he has stumbled or, managed to recreate, I think, what Alexander was doing. He's also he's looked a lot at Alexander's pictures. He's analyzed them in great detail. He's analyzed the little videos. He's analyzed the original games like Mantelpiece. He's used a whole mosaic of things. And of course, he went to a number of first generation teachers as well, and he's put it together. But as I say, my real evidence is that it matches what Goldie brought about in me. And she was closest to Alexander, and she was doing something very different. Does that answer your question?
Well, half. it seems that then Jando has created them all,
Well,
because they're not necessarily related to what you've been saying at all. So some of these things are quite unrelated, in fact, to the way that normal Alexander teachers function.
well, that's what intrigues me, you see, because a lot of what Alexander was doing, I believe, got lost along the way. Not out of anybody's fault, but because of a series of, the way characters went, the way the communications happened, nothing was particularly explained. If you read Lily Westphelt, she's so frustrated that there's no explanation of what is happening on that first training course. And in the end, Patrick MacDonald says he gets his little group around him, Marjorie Barlow and Lily Westphelt and Kitty Villapolska, and they formed a little group and they said, he's not telling us how to let the neck be, to take the head forward. No, we've got to work it out. And they created what became the training course method. Now that's written up in Lily Westphelt, and John Hunter then asked Erica about it, and she said, yes, that's exactly what's happened. And John Hunter has written up his interviews with Erica. And then Marjorie Barlow was asked the same questions, and she said, yes, I was part of that group. That's what we did. So something shifted at that point. And what I feel is that, and it's no disrespect to the training course leaders such as yourself, who have done superb work over the years, keeping everything alive, so that we can arrive at this point and start asking, okay, so what was Alexander himself doing? And are we quite doing what he was doing? Or somehow are we doing what Carrington was doing and what MacDonald were doing, which was their understanding?
Was tat, war irgendwie alles, was wir taten.
Hang on, Rosa, have you got something going in the background there? Somebody's...
That was Rosa Louisa.
Yes.
Yeah, it still doesn't answer the question as far as I'm concerned.
Well,
it doesn't answer the question.
Okay, maybe it doesn't. Does anyone else have a comment on this? That you see things, Goldie was angry. That's undeniable. Everybody who went to her commented on how angry Goldie was. And it took me a long time to realize she was angry because she felt that what had come down to us as the modern technique was not what Alexander was doing. And she was, desperate is the wrong word, but she was passionate to try and get the explanation, to get what he was actually doing across before she died. And Erica Whitaker likewise gave workshops where she also tried to communicate what was happening before the first training course. And I think this is quite hard for us to hear. It's hard for us to hear that maybe we haven't got the whole picture. We've done our trainings and now, there's this other stuff that we didn't get, but it's also very exciting. Jill.
And also, I think most people come through conventional trainings with lots of unanswered questions.
Thank you.
And certainly this studying I've done with you, you've filled in a lot of the gaps for me. And I've been teaching 19 years. I've been teaching successfully 19 years. And now I feel my knowledge and my understanding is better, is broader.
And you trained with the Carringtons.
That's right.
You trained at one of the sources.
That's right.
And you're not the only person who said that to me. Just as I've filled in my questions, so this work seems to fill in questions for people. Yeah, this is why it's been such a journey to uncover it. You see, Alexander wrote his very first book, Man Supreme Inheritance, back in 1910, the first edition was, and then 1912, he developed use of the hands and he rewrote the book to say, actually, you need the teacher's hands. And then he rewrote it again in 1918, really saying, you can't do this on your own, you have to use the hands. Whereas the very first editions have him talking the pupil through the cigar box procedure. And then in the later editions, that's gone. He's no longer telling the pupil how to do it. He's showing them with his hands and then maybe giving them some directions to say. And it was a wonderful moment for him, I think, when he developed the use of the hands, because again, the accounts show how frustrated he would get that people couldn't understand. He started off trying to teach people to think, to observe, and to self-discover as he did. And he got so frustrated that they didn't understand. They couldn't get what he was doing. They wouldn't do the thinking. And there are tales back from 1913, 1914 of AR standing at one end of the room and shouting at a pupil, and FN standing at the other end of the room shouting at a pupil. Where does "don't excite the fear" reflexes come into that? And then when he discovered he could use his hands, it must have made life a lot easier for him. And then there's that very telling point in Lily Westfeld's account where he comes into the training course one day, say halfway through, I think, and says, I no longer have to get them even trying to think. I can do it entirely through my hands. And she said that improved his temper. She never saw him lose his temper again. For him, it was so much easier. But something in that moment was lost for the technique. And there's a great moment in Sean Carey's interview with Marjorie Barlow, where Sean talks about that. And Marjorie, to start with, does the good niece answer and says, well, yes, of course, it was wonderful. He could use his hands. And Sean then says, but surely this isn't what the pupil wants. And Marjorie promptly does a volte-face and says, of course not. You've got to get the pupil thinking right from the beginning. You've got to get it doing it for themselves. And of course we have. And particularly for modern pupils, they need to know what they're doing. They need to have the understanding. And the understanding we now have. We couldn't have done this understanding before 20 years ago. The neuroscience has only just arrived. The functional anatomy has only just arrived. We've only just got the material to explain it. And Alexander, with the best will in the world, couldn't have explained it. Not 100 years ago, not even 70 years ago. 50 years ago, you couldn't explain it. 30 years ago, you could perhaps begin. But it's very recent that we can explain it. So this is new. And that, I think, also allows us to go back and say, what were they doing? Anyone else want to comment here? This is, inflammatory stuff, as it were. Doug, you're smiling. Would you like to comment? You're eating your dinner, so. Anyone like to say anything? Rosa.
Yeah, I would like to share my experience with your 10 courses, online courses. I am also a long-time teacher. Mm-hmm. I was always searching for clarification to understand it. So I started your course. In the beginning, it was so challenging. I had to confront myself that my coordination was not according to what you were sharing during those lessons. But they felt so intriguing that I continued the process. It's now 1 year later. I went through months of difficult times because my whole body started to change. But nowadays, last weeks or in this time now, things are beginning to fall into place, and I have a total different coordination, and I begin to experience myself toward lightness. But the most important is the presence in my action, the thinking and awareness presence, which I have even more learned how to give myself. So my experience is that I really can say that to follow those steps you are giving, and also in the book, is worthwhile to give it a try. and don't mind moments of challenge, moments of being confronted with habits which you never would have been discovering. And it is so rich, more than I would have even never imagined to receive. So if you have doubts or questions, then do the course.
Thank you.
And go into the process and don't give up. Really don't give up. Move through it. It is very special.
Thank you. And in a sense, what you've described is the process that I had to go through with Ms. Goldie, to let go of what I thought I knew and allow something different to come into play. And it did take, as I say, it was 6 months before I could even sit upright again. It was a process that took a lot of courage to go through, and I wouldn't have missed it for the world. And one of her phrases was, "You need to go into the unknown."
Yeah.
And this is exactly what we need to be doing all the time, is going into the unknown. And these processes do. We learn to get out of the way in a very different way, so that we stay embodied, but we stay completely present. But we get out of the way so that then when we give consent, something completely different can come about and we can just observe it. And I talk about this in terms of right and left brain, because I think again, this is something Alexander couldn't explain, but Frank Pierce Jones did. Frank Pierce Jones actually knew this. And he writes in his book, Freedom to Change, about how every time AR tried to get him out of the chair, he just went straight back into his old use. And then he realized that he had to include the entire room. He had to open his field of awareness to include everything. And that allowed him to stay out of the way so that AR could bring about a new use in him. And then he then writes, and I could then do it for myself. And it's one of the keys that, that we're told we can't do it for ourselves, and we can. And that's one of the keys that we need. And that's why I say, there are things that got lost. There are other things that never got articulated. Alexander never wrote that. Frank Pierce Jones is the only one that I know who wrote that down, and nobody else picked up on it. It didn't become part of the mainstream technique. What a pity. Erica Whitaker knew about it, but she never wrote it. I suspect Marjorie Barstow knew about it, actually, and was doing it across the pond, much to the disgust of Sept. She was working without hands, scandal. But I think she was using that bit. And that, of course, came from Irene Tasker, because Irene Tasker was one of Alexander's very, very first teachers. And she was working with the children. All the time she was working with children. And to start with, she was working with children before she'd even been trained by FM. He was just saying, get on and help that child do less, help them use their use better. And she was thinking, how? She became very interested in connection. And of course, if you're working with a child, you are working all the time in application, or at least most of the time. And during the first training course, she would do at homes, where the trainees would go to her home in the evening, and they would all cook dinner together. And she would get them thinking about their use in activity. Well, funnily enough, the one person who didn't go to that was Patrick MacDonald. And so he wasn't interested in all that. And that he was one of the central figures that then gave us the training course method. And so, again, spatial awareness, perhaps at that point, again, was evaporated. It just got lost. It got sort of taken below. Sometimes things aren't lost. They just became inarticulated, like breathing, which was sort of done, but it stopped getting any focus to it. I'm talking too much. Who would like to say something? Jill.
Just on the point of spatial awareness, it's so simple, but so fundamental. And I having learned that with you now, which I was using it to a level before, but now I'm using it all the time. And now I'm teaching in person again. I'm teaching pupils I know, pupils who know me very well, and I'm applying spatial awareness with them. It's changed the way I'm teaching. It's changed the way I'm relating to the pupils. And in an interesting way, because we're still aware of social distancing and all of this, I'm maintaining more physical space between me and the pupil, and the pupils are getting better results. From a distance, even though you're in the same room, the pupil has to do the thinking. So I'm making a better job now, I think, of helping my pupils do the thinking. And I'm not relying entirely on the hands-on skills. In fact, I seem to be doing very little hands-on touching right now.
But they're there if you need them.
It's an evolution, of course, it's an evolution. I feel like I've evolved my understanding and teaching. And it's so simple. Makes me wonder why I didn't realize it before.
Shall we play a game together on spatial awareness? Jonathan, would you like to say something? Yes, please.
I'll say something. So I'm not sure if this is accurate, but I teach musicians and I often tell them, imagine if Mozart taught composition. Because right when Alexander first started teaching this work, his musician friend says, oh, this is so good for you. Why don't you teach us? And he was like, oh, I'm just taking care of myself. So it's kind of like he was thrust into doing this. And the frustration that his students wouldn't think. And then, when he could give the hands-on, oh, thank goodness, I don't have to waste. And my teacher also talked a lot about breathing, my training director, and the dart using the eyes. And so listening to your interviews with Robert Rickover, you can't separate the mind from the body or the individual from the environment. So that made perfect sense. And now when I go to make my coffee, I wait, I bring myself to quiet, I see the mug, and the hand, it moves in a different way. I'm not trying to control it. So I think it's fascinating. And of course, using the eyes, so simple. But Alexander was a, quote, genius. He taught himself. He wouldn't mention it much. I think Marjorie Barlow, in an interview with Sean Carey, she did talk about the environment, but she also was at those application days, and she did that with her training students too.
Yes, she knew about application.
Is there room in your Monday, every other week book study left?
There is. Yes, please jump in. Yes.
Thank you.
I'll talk about it at the end. Yes. Rywin, and then I know Charles, you want to.
Hi, I just had a question. I'm just following up Rosa Luisa's comments. Like, do you offer a course online, or I assume it was online given what we've all been through?
Okay. Yes, the course Rosa Luisa is talking about is still available, but I'm sort of running that down now. And the main course that's running now is the Book Study Club. So that's the one Jonathan was talking about. And in the Book Study Club, it's run on the same principles as the online course, and it actually has the same material, because the online course came about because I just got the book to the publishers and thought, jolly good, I'll have a jolly good rest for the next few months and do a bit of editing as they need it, but I'm going to have a rest. And then lockdown happened and COVID, and teachers needed to know how to work online. So promptly I was into teaching full-time online, and I used all the material for the book. So the Book Study Club, we meet every fortnight, every 2 weeks, as Jonathan just said, and everybody reads. We say, look, so let's work on chapter 3 this week, and everybody has a study buddy. Everybody has somebody they exchange with, and they work through the explorations together, and that's marvelous, because firstly, you're helping each other through these strange, often unfamiliar, quite challenging and new experiences. And you're encouraging each other, watching each other, stay with it, keep your mind out of the way, and so on, helping each other do that. What you're also doing is then honing your observational skills of the other person. And you're learning to guide your fellow teacher through words, because most of us weren't trained to communicate these ideas through words. We were trained to communicate through our hands. And so to train, and the words need to be precise. And one needs to use them in positive ways and so on. There's a lot to using the words. And also the way we use the voice with the words and how we keep our embodiment with the words. We absolutely need to be doing it for ourselves as we're doing it for them. And then the next thing we need to be doing, once we've guided them into what's happening, is we then need to coax feedback out of them, because one does this for a pupil and you get them, say, to get their neck, doing something different. And you say, how's that? And they go, okay, give me some more words here. Nice. Yes, okay. So tell me about whether you notice anything about your neck. It feels longer and freer. Right, now we're getting somewhere. And for a pupil to be able to start to articulate what's happening for them is also very powerful, because it's bringing them more conscious of what they're doing. And then they've got more facility at home to start noticing, oh yes, my neck is no longer feeling free and long, it's gone short. Now what did we do? And they've got then the right concepts and the right procedures to take it back in the other direction, but to stay out of their own way, watch what happens and not just fix it. So it's very, very powerful, and pupils love this stuff. They love coming away going, I can do this for myself. Yeah.
So just as someone who hasn't been teaching for a long time, I put the technique aside. It didn't answer a lot of my questions, and I did a lot of, I learned a lot about trauma and the autonomic nervous system, which actually felt more appropriate for me. But I do love the work and I would like to come back, but I need something else. So it sounds like this might be a way to kind of re-educate myself. I don't feel like I've got enough to start again with, and it sounds like that what you're offering might be a good re-entry, as it were.
It's a perfect re-entry, actually, because you build yourself back up again from the beginning, and you learn to verbalize it. You learn to observe yourself more carefully. You really learn to work on yourself, and you learn an awful lot about the autonomic nervous system. The whole of chapter 5 is the autonomic nervous system. Our work is all about the autonomic nervous system. Come to quiet, because without being in that state of quiet, that parasympathetic, we are not aware of ourselves. This is Stephen Porges' work, the polyvagal system, which I'm sure you know about. But then Dan, he named that the social state as well. But it's also the self-observation state. If we're not in that parasympathetic, not merely can we not see other people really to relate to in a healthy, wholesome way, we also can't relate to ourselves. So it's crucial, and this is the state of quiet that Goldie was talking about. And it is the state, I think, where I hypothesize anyway, where we come much more into the right brain, into spatial awareness, and where things start to self-organize. So it's our access point. Without coming to quiet, nothing else can change. So I was talking a bit more about the book study club, which I would have talked about at the end, but we'll talk about it now since we're on to it. So there's the, yes, Charles, in one moment, I know you're waiting. So you do the exchanges, and then we get together once a fortnight. You can ask questions. I talk people through explorations together. We can master classes a bit, and we all move through together. And then there are quizzes and questionnaires, and so you can check your own understanding. And I've also done my own little anatomy coloring sheet, so people can learn their functional anatomy. So there's lots in there. And we work through it over perhaps 9 months to a year, because, as Rosa Louisa says, that's what it takes. We can't just, this isn't a book to read in an evening. Yeah, how does that sound?
That sounds fabulous.
Thank you. Charles, you've been champing at the bit there.
Yes, well, I really wanted to go back to the pools actually, and also Alexander's influences and the fact that, like all geniuses, there's always this feeling that they've built everything out of nothing, and they are totally got this eureka, um, idea and developed it from nothing. And then we've discovered more recently about Delsarte's work. But I mean, there was another person that influenced Alexander, and I can't remember. I think you mentioned it somewhere in your book. Who was the other person?
Well, John Dewey was the other big influence, but that was more on the philosophical side, and that's well
Yes.
known. The amazing book on this is Jerome Starring's book, his PhD thesis on the background of Alexander, and he's done a remarkable piece of work. Not all of it's true, I suspect, but he's looked at all the influences, everything that was going on in Tasmania at the time, everything that was going on in Sydney and Melbourne at the time. He's looked at all the letters between, Alexander and Spicer and so on, and there's actually masses of influences. Alexander was actually working with singing teachers, with natural breathing coaches, and that's why his first work was natural elocution, because that, I think, was some of the first work he did to try and put himself back together again, was he found natural breathing methods.
Yes.
Yeah, was that the one you were remembering?
Well, certainly he was first, when he first starts teaching, he's known as the breathing man, and I have actually somewhere photocopies of his pamphlets that he produced, and it was all through breathing.
Yes.
Yes. He was working initially.
And they're all in articles and lectures.
Yes,
it's amazing if you read the first sort of 5-10 years of his work in articles and lectures. It's all about breathing.
Yes.
Yeah.
And as we know, breathing is very much another way in to the work. And I know I found your breathing workshops very useful for me, and have always found breathing an important side of things, being a musician as well. And it's very interesting that people hold their breath when they are concentrating and don't realize it.
Yes.
And we're not aware. I mean, you become more aware of these things through the work. And so much of it is self-discovery, but it's also self-exploratory, what we're doing. But going back to Delsarte, his work, he was working, wasn't he, with mirrors as well?
Yes.
So the idea is that Alexander spent 7 years in front of multiple mirrors was because he was basing some of his thoughts were coming directly from Delsarte's work, and he was then reinterpreting them and moving them forwards. So it wasn't what he came up with was actually grew out of that, rather than being something that was totally new. I mean, obviously there are elements that he realized were very important, and he developed further. But I think this whole idea that that Alexander didn't, it's always seemed to me that Alexander did find it very hard to explain what he was what he had achieved. And one of the things I'd say about your book is it sort of demystifies the technique, puts it more in scientific terms, so that people can get rid of the magic in it, as the mysticism, which I think is very important in the 21st century. I thought the pools were actually were a Delsarte thing.
Yes.
Were they not?
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
so Alexander was using Delsart's
But
pulse.
but we don't really know what Delsart was doing. Delsart wrote notes, but if you go online and find some of the Delsart's original writings, it's impossible. It's all about spirituality. It's about these connections between mind and spirit and soul and matter, and it's meaningless spiritual rubbish.
Right, so it's very difficult to pin down.
And every so often it's very difficult to pin down, and every so often you come across a sentence and you go, okay, like the law of there's a law of opposition, there's a law of extension, that only when things are lengthening are they going in the right direction. There's a law of opposition, a number of the idea that you can't think in the body. He says, there's one point where he says, there's no such thing as a lame and humpback body. There are only lame and humpbacked minds. In other words, everything going on in the body starts in the brain. Well, hey, there's an Alexander idea if ever there was one. So, there's faulty sensory perception straight away, and the idea that we've actually got to stay out of the way. So a lot of the core concepts are right back there in Delsart. But none of Delsart's other supporters picked up on these. They all went a much more physical route.
This idea of the mind and the brain, of course, is very important because of the fact that I know in my early Alexander lessons, my teacher would be working on my arm or something, and I would be feeling it out, and she would be saying, "What are you doing?" Ticking me off for feeling it out, because you've got to very much be the commander and realize that, Alexander was very against sort of thinking in the way that people think thinking means, because you ask somebody to think and they immediately do something rather than think through the process, send the message from the brain through the nervous system via the synapses and the motor neurons to that particular part of the body, where it will then happen as any good commander knows. If they believe that once they've given an order, it will happen. They don't need to go and check up on it.
And I call it sending an email, which actually I got from Missy Vineyard, because she came up with the same idea. I got mind in the brain from Miss Goldie.
Yes.
And Missy Vineyard calls it coming up to your attic, for those who's and then the idea that you have to send an email to your hand, and the hand will then send a sensory email back, and you don't have to go down and check. It's an incredibly important concept. Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Charles. Let's all do a little exploration together for those who haven't experienced any of this before, or haven't experienced in this way, about coming to quiet, spatial awareness, and self-organization, and see what happens. Is everybody up for that? That's some of you have done this with me before. So I want you to imagine a feather that goes from your nose and it goes out to something that you're looking at, and it tickles it. And of course, that feather has wisps along it. So we're not tunneling ourselves down the feather. We're staying back and letting the wisps between the wisps of the feather have space. So I'm at this end of the feather, and what I'm seeing is at the other end of the feather. And my feather isn't fixing, it isn't sticking, it's moving gently, because that's what the eye needs to do to stay alive. It always has to be moving. And as it's doing that, you might start really noticing things about the things you're looking at, the thing you're looking at, that you haven't perhaps seen before. You might notice something else about its texture or its color. You might even get a sense of its texture through this idea of the feather tickling it, whether what you're tickling is smooth or rough. And then let your eye begin to track a little bit. And what you're seeing, what you're doing also with the feather, is inviting both your eyes and your attention to converge at the same point. Because most of the time, our attention is somewhere else to where we're looking. And even although we might have two apparently perfect eyes, according to the optician, usually one of them is doing the work and the other one's trailing along behind. So when we use the feather, again, we're encouraging both eyes to converge. And of course, it's not the nose that sees, it's the brain. So it's certainly not even the eyes that see. So think of your nose feather coming right through to the back of your brain, which is where the visual cortex is. That's actually where it's doing the seeing. And now you might notice the space between you and what you're looking at getting even bigger. A sense of the fullness of space. You might step into a sense that space is almost palpable, space itself. And once we've seeing from the back of the head, we've also got our full peripheral vision, but that's there as well. The whole room is there around us. We've got space above us, the space behind the object we're looking at, the space between the objects that we're seeing, the space behind us, below us. And that brings us into the scene, because so often if we're just concentrating on our computer, for instance, we're just focusing on the computer and we've lost any sense of self. But when you're in relationship across this space, you're in relationship to the object. And that really does mean relationship. The object will draw you, it's informing you. You're probably even informing it, who knows? And that spatial relationship then brings in your awareness of self. You might be more aware of your backside on the chair, of your breath flowing in and out, of your feet on the floor, maybe of your back, of your volume. As you're aware of the volume of the room, and you're in this almost precise relationship to what you're actually looking at. And then let your eyes go for a little track, as if the feather is tickling along and it tickles onto the next object. And then maybe if you've got objects on a table, it tickles across the table and then onto the next object or across the wall. The feather is always touching something. And so even what we would normally just sort of jump over with the eyes, the feather will slide across so that you're not allowing the eyes to jump. They are stroking their way along. And neither are you letting them stop and glaze or fix. You're letting them glide along. And now let them glide around to the right, taking in each object in turn and the space between, just letting the feather tickle along. And you'll find that your neck self-organizes. Your head leads, your eyes are leading, your head will follow, and the neck self-organizes. It will turn, and there's no sense of muscles working because the balance in the neck is brought about by this direct information through the eyes. And so there's no sense of strain, just the muscles look after themselves. And then the eyes can come back to the front. And then they can go down a bit. So you can track, I wouldn't go down the computer, it's too stimulating. Maybe go to a bookshelf or something and go down your bookshelf or something that's visually interesting to let your eyes go down, and you'll find that your head will nod on the neck. And then let your head come up again. The eyes come up again, sorry. Let the eyes tickle their way back up from book to book to book. Don't get, if you are on a bookshelf, by the way, don't get caught on words. Words are just shapes, they're just hieroglyphics. See the colors and the textures. And then if you keep going, you can even go up. And if your eyes keep engaging, then actually you can take your eyes a long way up and your head will come up on your neck, but there's no sense of the head being pulled back. So the head can actually self-organize to look up at the ceiling without any constriction, and the whole body is now lengthening into this upward glance, this upward intention, And then I can let the eyes come back down again. And the head will self-organize itself back to level. Does anyone notice that as you do that, actually the system comes quite calm? That you come present, you come quiet, perhaps the breathing becomes fuller. Would anyone like to comment, Ilana?
Yeah, I found it staggering, my neck. As you said that, it just felt so light and just incredible. That was fascinating. Mm.
Even going right up to the ceiling.
Yeah, effortless.
Effortless. Yes.
Yeah, amazing.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Lovely. Anyone else like to comment on that? Raywin, how was that on your nervous system?
Sorry, it was lovely, very calming and very, a lot of length and freedom. Lovely.
And there's now been science on tracking with the eyes. It's one of the quickest ways, it's been discovered to be one of the quickest ways of bringing the nervous system to calm. So it's where I start now with most pupils at the beginning of the lesson, is I get them just looking in this way. Jill.
In one of the books I have on the polyvagal system, his simple, quick way of activating the calm polyvagal is to simply keep your head still and just look to one side with the eyes.
Right.
And it's with practice for teachers, anybody with Alexander experience, it's almost instantaneous.
I didn't know that one. That's interesting.
I'll send you the book reference.
Thank you. Yes.
He says he looks for 3 different signs. One is a sigh, one is a yawn, and one is a swallow.
Mm-hmm.
I always sigh.
Yes. Yes. Well, a sigh is always a good sign, isn't it? Of something settling, something settling down.
Calm.
Yes. Yes. And of course, the method EMDR, I don't know whether people know of that. It's a method for really sorting post-traumatic stress syndrome, and it's done through tracking eyes. It's and through that they actually can really sort serious post-traumatic stress. It's fascinating what can be done through the eyes. Anyone else like to comment on what happened there?
There's something which I'm sort of curious about, but perhaps not related at all, but I just wanted your thoughts. And that is very specific. When I'm teaching children the piano, I always start with them looking at the music, even if it's only middle C and it's their first lesson. It's very, very easy. And so they just look at the music and their hands, once it's found middle C, their hands, they don't, they can just, the hands just sort of go. And I don't know if that's a similar thing, that your eyes are concentrating on the music. I say to them, you don't look down at the piano. It's like, if you're kicking a football, you don't look at the football, your foot kicks it and it sort of goes. And it's the same idea, but I don't know if that's remotely related.
I think it is, actually. I think it is, because after all, when we look at what we're trying to do, whether it's playing the piano or thinking too hard about parking the car, we try and get consciously involved, and then we're trying to override the circuits that wants to just do it for itself. The joke about the centipede, ask a centipede how it walks, how it coordinates 100 legs, and it will never be able to do it again. The whole point about the centipede is the internal mechanism sort it. And again, the way I write about this in the book is central pattern generators, which is something people don't know about. These intrinsic circuits, these innate circuits that are in the brainstem and the spinal cord, and they're organizing our movement for us. And they give us the building blocks of movement. And when we stay out of the way, then we allow these to come into play. So yes, if your pupil looks down at the keys, they're trying to superimpose their movement on it. And it's going to be too slow apart from anything else.
Yeah,
You know,
definitely.
because conscious movement is way behind unconscious movement. There's a fascinating one of this one. Somebody said, I forget who, I think I've quoted this in the book and I can't remember quite who it was at the time. I think it was one of the, anyway, this man, I think he was one of the Nobel Prize winners, who noticed that in cowboy films, there was always a shootout at the end where the bad guy drew his gun and or went for his gun, and the good guy was able to draw first and shoot. And so he said to himself, is that just a device? Or is there something real here? And so he tried it out in his lab with his assistants with water pistols. And one of them played good guy and one of them played bad guy. And the bad guy would think about going for the gun and would go consciously to draw it. And the good guy would simply respond like the cat to the mouse and was able to draw first. So there we have the difference between organizing it consciously and allowing the process to unconscious it. And what one wants to develop in a musician is that link between seeing the note and the brain knows what the note means and actually coordinates the fingers accordingly.
I suppose it's like that, sorry to speak again, but like that incredible, I don't know if you've ever seen it on YouTube, of, I can't think of her name, Portuguese pianist, Maria Joao something or other. And she was going to play this Mozart, she'd come all prepared to play this Mozart piano concerto. And as the orchestra started up in the concert hall, she realized they were playing a different Mozart concerto. And she kept trying to sort of say to the conductor, this isn't the one I've learned, this isn't the one I'm doing. And he was super confident and he knew she was a super pianist. And he just smiled sweetly and just carried on, and the orchestra just carried on. And then the moment came and she just note perfect. She hadn't practiced it for ages, but it was just all there, you know. It's staggering to watch it actually, because she was in an agony beforehand. And then it got to the moment and then she just played, you know. Similar thing in a way, isn't it? I suppose.
Yes, except that's a learned thing, and what we're looking to discover is innate things. But yes, learning is learning because the discovery process. We have this idea we have to practice and practice and practice and practice to make something happen. And learning actually is a discovery process. That we are in relationship. Amazing tale of a man who came to see me, who was a player of a sarod, which is an Indian instrument like a sitar. And he was a professional, and he'd had an accident and he'd lost that much of one of his fingers on the left hand. And he was in bits because he thought, I'm never going to be able to play again. And he'd had 6 months healing, and he came to me for lessons. And he said, you know, I have spent years building up brain maps of where my hands go to make all these different chords. And those brain maps are now useless. And am I ever going to be playing again? And I used the process with him that I use in chapter 15 and chapter 16 of this, stay out of the way and let it happen. And we first brought his hand just up into relationship. And then I said, just let your hand form the A chord. And he just let his hand form the A chord. And the brain reorganized it so that that cut off finger was absolutely correct. And he got it. He got it in one lesson. It was amazing. He was a meditator, so he just got it. And he'd said he'd play a practice concert a couple of weeks' time, just for friends. And he just practiced in this way of stay out of the way, let my fingers find their own way. And his friends came up to him at the end of the concert and said, we have never heard you play like that. And I didn't see him again because his phone started ringing. The bookings came in. And I went to a concert of his a couple of years later, and it was brilliant. And afterwards I went up to him and I said, have you built up a whole load of new brain maps? And he said, I haven't allowed them to happen. He said, I now always play out of this discovery process. And that's amazing. And that's what we're after. Every time we put hands on somebody's neck, are we doing something that's done before, or are we allowing that neck to call our hands into a new use? And every time we pick up our coffee mug, the same thing. This is the challenge. This is a huge challenge, but it's about coming present, and that's what Goldie really wanted of us. So, Jonathan, would you like to comment on that?
More, well, I've had a few experiences too in the morning. Like I wake up to go back to coffee and I go to open the cabinet. This was in my training years before I knew much about bringing the mind to the brain. But I'd open the cabinet and I would see the coffee bag start to fall out in my other hand. Before I could consciously think, it caught it. So I call it like a ninja moment. But the more I work with this, bringing the mind to the brain, you know, as an oboe player, bringing the mind to different parts of the body, getting it gunked up, suffering from anxiety, never wanting to touch it again. And I haven't played it in over a year, and I won't until it calls me or I feel joy from that. But the more I work from sending the signal and trusting it goes through, it's like I can trust myself again. Or for the first time ever.
Yes.
And so I moved from Ann Arbor, and now I'm in Bloomington, Indiana, teaching at the Jacob School, group classes. And it is exhausting to put hands on all of those students so quickly. So now it's like, back up, get them to use their eyes, reserves my energy. It's just really fascinating. So I'm excited for the group study because I'm not a scientist, and I've picked through here because I love the drama and, you know, Alexander, the myth of the self-made man, which I respect him. I'm grateful for him, but no. So I've read those bits, but I haven't done the sciencey parts because that's not my background. But if I have a study buddy, I'll be encouraged to read it. So thank you so much.
Absolutely, yes, because I mean, I've tried to write it all in layman's terms. So, you know, it's hopefully, my mother's read it all, and she's not a scientist. She coped with it fine. I think that's a good measure. So, yeah, and that's marvelous. And I hope one day you will pick up your oboe again. I mean, my first illness I had to let go, because I've had these two big illnesses with ME. The first one I had to let go of dancing. And I didn't dance for several years. And then when I danced again, it was completely different. And the second one, I had to let go of singing. And the same thing happened. So there's a discovery. Go on.
Well, the woman I got my master's degree from, when she was 22, she was hit head on by a drunk driver. Her knees crushed her jaw, knocked out all of her teeth, broke all the bones in her right wrist, like 9 reconstructive surgeries. They said she'd never play again. She must have gone through some similar process, because now she's gone on to perform all over the world, has recorded over a dozen CDs. So I know, and she told me, it's like riding a bike. As long as you do music when you're young, it's always there. You can always come back to it. So yes. I'll eventually get back to it, I think.
Which is why I could do that leap that's on the front of the book, despite the fact that twice I've had 3 years where I couldn't walk. And once those pulls started to get going, the springiness came back, and I felt like an 8-year-old. And it took about an hour of leaping that rock to get that picture. And there's no way I could have done that over about a period of about 15 or 20 years. That would not have been possible. You know, it's amazing what's still in us when we can let it out. And the pulls also, they get that youthfulness. They're anti-aging. You know, seriously, guys, if you want not to get old, do the pulls. They're fantastic for stopping aging. Anyone else agree with that? Here am I putting my boat up? Yep, thank you.
I can vouch for that, not for myself, but I've known you a long time, and I've seen you rebuild yourself. I've seen you re-energize yourself. You're living proof.
Thank you. So, any other
questions? I should probably try it.
You should, absolutely, you should. Any other questions? Lasny, how are you getting on there? Do you have any questions there? Charles, yes, Lasny, yeah. Some.
Hi, no, I'm just really enjoying all the conversation, and yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah, I started to read it at the beginning of the summer. Get to page 55, I'm really excited about all the science and all the rest. And actually about the polls, I don't know if it was discarded or it has been Jandot, but there is a way of moving in a certain way with correct directions, you know, hands are very good and everything, but when you are there alone, and I haven't done your course yet, but I'm willing to do the book club, and but I have done the smart yoga training, and doing something practical like that, you see how I don't mind if they are those directions or whose directions, but it's about moving correctly, and you are able to do more with more ease. And that direction of, you know, the lower ribcage back as well has helped me a lot with every warrior 1, warrior 2, anything in yoga, anything, and then to walk for anything. So yeah, all the directions you use from Jando, whatever, and all the summary you have done in the book that I have just started to read it. It's fantastic, you know, like your own personal experience plus all the things you're putting there is like, wow, it's great. I mean, for us, it's great to have it there already done. So thank you. And
that's an interesting one about the proof, because one can ask, as Robin did, where's the proof that Alexander was doing it? And that's a very fair question. But ultimately, the proof is, does it bring us the goals that we're after? Does it make us springier? Does it make life easier? Does it help us lift a heavy weights? Does it help us carry a child? Does it help us, you know, swallow more easily? All these things in life that we need to be able to do, to walk miles. Does it actually help? And the answer, particularly when there are some of the pulls in that Jando does that Alexander didn't do, some of the stuff with the feet was not Alexander's. And to start with, it was like, what's going on here? But they've absolutely proved themselves to me, and then to everybody I've worked with. And that to me is the proof. And then I came across, somebody passed me this thing about a surgeon who works with reconstructing hips, and he showed a picture of the foot in the alignment that it should be, for the right alignment for the hip, and there it was. And you know, so I think there's a lot of people discovering this same stuff. Alexander, I think, culturally couldn't do that with the foot because it would have been too outside the norm of the time, just as I think he couldn't at that time really discuss pelvic floors. It would not have gone down in Victorian England. So I think there are things we can do now that he actually, some of which he was doing, but couldn't articulate, even if he thought to. You know, things move on. Yes, lovely, thank you. Anyone else want to comment before we finish up? Therese, I've not heard from you. Would you like to say something?
Well, I did. I've read the book. I got it in May. I'm in Alaska, and took a while to get here. So I got it and I read it through, and then basically took a week of retreat and read it all over. I went out to visit my son and had a lot of time all by myself. And then I started teaching it to, I just have a few students. I'm a fairly new teacher. I just got done with my training in 2018. Mm-hmm. And so I've been working with folks, but my questions and my ideas are a little more basic. They're things like, how much pull do you actually do? Because in my training, everything was supposed to be quite subtle, and I'm not sure, you know, if you're talking about something pretty strong or things like that. That's kind of where I'm coming from.
That's exactly the sort of question we address in the book study club, because that question comes up over and over again. Is this too much? Is this too little? Is it the right alignment? And of course, the answer is different for different people and on different days, but that's where we do work with people in the club, and everybody learns and you get a feel for it. So I don't know whether you've thought of joining the book study club, but I'd encourage you to do that, because you're out there playing with it, which is fantastic. You've taken it straight into your playing. So yes, I'm not going to try and give you the instant answer on that one now, but yeah, there's lots of material there, because it is, and it's feeling away with how do I do it with a student with shoulder difficulties? How do I do it with somebody who's all collapsed, who's all over tense that way, and so on? And all that is part of what can be brought and discussed. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question for the moment. Yes, thank you. That's lovely to hear. Lily, hello.
Yes. I've had my sound off because I'm having construction here. Hopefully the noise will hold off. But I wanted to comment what you said about Marjorie Barstow, because that's my lineage of training. And we, with all my teachers in her original lineage, worked a lot with vision and eyes and spatial awareness. So I think you're right on in your perception of how she taught. And also to say that my introduction to you is through Sheila Hale, who took your class, and she makes me smile also. But she's shown me some of the stretches, and wow, they just make such a difference, just profoundly helpful.
Lovely. Yes, and she's in Tasmania. Where are you?
I'm in Tennessee. Yeah.
Yes. Oh, that's lovely that you've had a go with somebody. So
Yes.
And they prove themselves. They do feel so strange, but if you stay with them, they prove themselves. That's interesting. That
Yeah.
you had that experience. Thank you for sharing. Thank you. Yeah. I was just looking up your name, Atsuko. Atsuko, would you like to say anything? I've heard a couple of people we haven't heard from.
I'm just listening the conversation, and because I'm the trainee, I'm a training course student, so I'm very happy to listen your conversation and your discussion. It's very interested for me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Rafaela, you're the last person we haven't heard from, I think. You want to say anything? No? Lovely. Okay, so Charles, you want to have the last word.
Right, I was just going to say, one of the things, of course, with the pulls is that one of the things it does, it reactivates the muscles which have long been dormant.
Yes.
And so the strong pull actually plays quite an important role in doing this. However, as we discovered in our work together, pulls, you do need to take, it's very important to take into account the injuries and the history of the person you're dealing with. As we discovered with my right shoulder, when we were in one of our early lessons, I think, together.
Yeah.
And although that, it was a very useful experience, because it was a good learning curve for me. And it was interesting. Then we had to we then focused actually more on that area to free it up, because basically I actually stopped being able to, I seized up, didn't I? I got a frozen shoulder practically.
Yes, and it taught us a lot about what was going on for you.
Yes.
The fact that happened was a learning experience in itself. It taught me a lot about what was going on for your shoulder. It taught you a lot as well. Pain is a teacher. And no harm in the end was done, was it? Because we were able to work with that, find a different way in. And now you've got a much freer shoulder.
I do have a much freer shoulder,
yeah.
Yes.
So this is where we have to be sometimes a little brave going into the end. Then one does have to be aware with injuries. This is why it is good to have a study buddy to play with. I've never seen any real harm done. Sometimes one touches into things stiffen up for a while, or maybe go into a bit of problem, back off. And then I work with breathing, as I think we did with you. One works from the inside, because the amazing thing about breathing is it's so dynamic. And because again, if you get it out of the way with breathing, the CPGs will organize it for you, these central pattern generators, and they will call different muscles into being. And they will, the breathing will, if used right, free things off again and show you then how to proceed so that you can then bring the pulls back in safely. So there's this interplay that I use between the pulls and then this much more non-doing, allowing work that is nonetheless dynamic, that brings in the dynamic play in a different way and is also reactivating muscles that haven't worked for a long time. And by going back and forth between the two, then we discover, and then we're using the directions as well, the knowledge of the functional anatomy and so on, to work out cognitively what actually is needed to get around the problem and free something off. So is that a fair reflection, do you think, of what we went through? Because it was an exciting journey in the end.
It is an exciting journey, and I've changed a lot since starting working with you. But I have known you many years as well. So certainly from the breathing work, that was nothing. And looking at your book, the first 6 chapters are very the sort of thing we'd done before.
Yes, they were my Miss Goldie workshops.
Yes,
that I've been doing since 2004. And then it's chapter 7 where things take a new turn.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank goodness. Finally.
Well, I think we better wind up. I can see my Raywin quickly. And then...
All right, just a very quick question. How long are the book club sessions?
Yes, they're an hour and a half.
An hour and a half, thank you.
It's 2 o'clock on a Monday. It starts again. It starts this Monday coming, 2 o'clock UK time. Where are you in the US? Which time zone?
I'm in Canada. I'm in Ottawa, Eastern Standard Time.
Eastern Standard Time. That's 5 hours early. That's 9 in the morning. Can you?
Great.
Yes, lovely.
Perfect.
Yes, be beautiful. So just to recap, I'll send everybody the recording afterwards, and I'll also send people the details of the book study club, and you can have a look at it and have a think about it. The way the club works, it's a subscription payment, so you join up, the payment is monthly, there's no long-term commitment. You stay in it for while it feels useful, but I would think it will take 9 months to a year to go through the book. It's not a quick book, it's not an evening read, as I said. And I'd love to see you in there and work with you and get you working with study buddies and hear your adventures with pupils with it. And it's an exciting journey. And
Can I just ask
take it with me? Yes, Charles.
What happens if if you would like to do this, but your commitments and your schedule don't allow you to be
at the seminars.
2 p.m.
Yes. And there's quite a lot. There are people who've done it from Australia, where it's the middle of the night for them, and all the sessions are recorded, and they can always send in questions to be answered in the seminars. There's a Facebook group, so they can interact on the Facebook group. People also send me emails sometimes, and so it works that way. They still have the study buddies. They still have the interaction that way. So yes, it is perfectly possible to do it for those who can't come to the seminars. Some people come and some people do it in the background, as it were.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's been a wonderful discussion this evening. Thank you very much to all of you. And hope to see you soon.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Penelope.
Thank you. Wonderful.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.